I'm David Strauser from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and today I want to talk a little bit about some issues that are impacting the career development and employment of individuals with disabilities and have the potential to impact career development and employment research related to individuals with disabilities. To start off with, I think it's important to put this research into a framework for us to understand how these issues may impact the career development process. And one model that has been used and is starting to get attention as a model to conceptualize career issues is the Illinois Work and Wellbeing Model. The Illinois Work and Wellbeing Model consists of three interrelated domains that are interrelated and impact the overall career development process. And I'm going to introduce that model and talk to you about that model and then talk about three issues that I think are extremely relevant. The Illinois Work and Wellbeing Model is based on the ICF framework and uses the components of the ICF to conceptualize functioning and how personal and environmental factors impact functioning and the overall career development process. The three domains have three elements that are important to understand. They're one, developmental in nature, meaning that this process is based on that individuals develop over the course of time, and that through their development they can acquire skills, abilities that allow them to interact with the domains differently as they mature or as they experience different life events or as different things happen to them within their life that may change their perspectives and their overall developmental trajectory. So developmental model and perspective is important. Second, this model is based on the concept of relationships, that individuals have relationships with both other individuals as well as the broader environment, and that these relationships are powerful forces that impact individuals' overall developmental process. It might be impacting their individual choices and how they choose to express themselves or interact with the broader world. Third component that is related to the domains that is important to understand is that this model implies that there's a dynamic nature and that things are changing, and this is consistent with the developmental model. Things are changing as people move along, as people progress, as things in the environment change, and therefore we always are needing to look at what components of the model might be impacted and how those changes in the model might be impacting other areas, other domains, other factors. One final thing related to the model that's important is that our ultimate focus in this model is on overall participation, and participation in four major areas that we'll see: community, home, social/personal, and also work. So we want to look at how we impact those four major areas, and what this model implies is that career development impacts those four major areas. So here I've got listed the three major domains and the factors that make up each domain. We'll see the model in a minute. But the contextual factor is the first factor that deals with personal, environmental, and functioning. So personal factors belonging to the individual, environmental factors belonging to the contextual environment which the individual interacts with, and then functioning, or sometimes we refer to this as limitations. How is a person functioning from a physical and mental health perspective? The career domain consists of three major components or three major factors related to the career development process. The process of becoming aware both of education and career opportunities that might be available to the individual or may be appropriate for the individual. Acquisition, how does an individual go about acquiring both educational and work opportunities? And then the third domain is maintenance. How do people go about maintaining connectivity to both work and education? Again, all to impact the outcome of participation in our four areas: community, home, work, and social. So here's a copy or a slide related to the Illinois Work and Wellbeing Model. We see here on the far left, as you're looking at the contextual domains with the three factors there: personal, environmental, and limitations, or also referred to as functioning. The middle domain, we see individual awareness, acquisition, and maintenance. and then on the far right we see participation. We see a little hash box between the contextual and the career development domain because we're putting interventions there. When we talk about interventions or intervening, whether it's something like supportive employment or career counseling, we are intervening to increase the congruence between the contextual domain and the career development domain. And those factors or those interventions have both effects that impact both the contextual and the career domain, but also have an indirect effect themselves on the participation domain. Now again, I don't want to talk more about the model right now. I want to address three issues that I think are important related to functioning. But I think it's important to understand that when I talk about these issues, this model provides a framework for helping us understand these issues and why they're important. The first issue that I want to talk about, and let me back up for just a minute and say this. These three issues that I'm going to talk about, I feel are very interconnected with each other and fit the dimensions that I talked about before, in that they're dynamic, and that they're developmental, and that they're based on relationships. And these three issues are interrelated to each other and meet those criteria. The first issue that I think is relevant, that is going to impact vocational rehabilitation services and impact participation in employment and education, is economic distress. Now, sometimes people might refer to that as poverty. I'm referring to economic stress to imply a broader context of economic impact. Poverty is a very defined term, and by the U.S. government, to define people below a certain income level to be living in poverty. But research has consistently shown that people who are well above the poverty level, 2 to 3 times above the poverty level, still experience significant distress that impacts them and impacts their functioning. So I think it's really important as rehabilitation counselors, rehabilitation professionals, people working within the rehab context, and people with disabilities, is that the broader economic distress that's within an individual's contextual environment, in the broader environment themselves, whether it's in their community or within their family, has direct and indirect impact on their overall career development process. We know, for example, wages are relatively stagnant. People have not experienced increases in earning capacity. We are seeing people, despite the relatively low unemployment rate, we're still seeing people drop out of the labor market overall. We're seeing people who are injured on the job being unable to continue to work and experiencing lost wages. These are just 3 examples of things that create stress economically on individuals that impact their overall functioning and impacts their overall physical and mental health functioning. So when we talk about economic distress, we're talking about a broad term that is going to be related to people's economic situation, both as individuals and families, and how that potentially impacts their functioning, both physically and mental health. Again, research suggests that people who experience more economic distress or live in families with more economic distress do not have as high physical and mental health functioning as people who live with less economic distress. So this is an area that we need to be aware of when we work with individuals. Related to that is trauma and trauma symptoms. So many times when we talk about trauma, people might think about post-traumatic stress disorder, which is certainly based on trauma. But we also know that people who may not meet the full diagnosis or the diagnostic criteria for PTSD still have adverse effects to trauma. So people experience traumatic events and trauma symptoms from family issues, environmental issues that they might be exposed to, incidents that happen at work, incidents that happen in their school or the broader community. But it's important for us to understand trauma as more of a continuum versus a discrete outcome. So people who experience trauma are more likely to experience traumatic events, that is related to economic distress. People who live in more economically distressed environments, communities, and families may be more likely to experience traumatic events or trauma symptoms, and trauma symptoms negatively impact the overall career development process. We know, for example, that increased trauma symptoms impacts people's relatedness to awareness, how aware they are of the different career options that are available to them. Higher levels of trauma symptoms are related to lower levels of awareness. Again, we know that people who live in economically distressed environments or families are more likely to experience traumatic events. These traumatic events impact people's motivation, desire to participate in work, their perception regarding the importance of work, and their overall engagement in society. So as rehabilitation professionals, we need to be aware that trauma symptoms and that impact this, and that the individuals that we work with in the rehabilitation context are highly likely to have experienced some type of trauma symptoms or have elevated trauma symptoms which may be negatively impacting their overall career development process and overall employment. The third issue related to this is the family. And we know that the family involvement in the rehab process, and specifically when young adults, if we have a family that views it as important that individuals work and engage in work-related activities, value work, they're going to have better rehabilitation outcomes. That research, especially in the area of special ed and transition school to work, have documented that getting the family involved is critically important. But building on our first two issues of economic distress and trauma, this may be more challenging than just we may initially think, because families that we're working with may be in economic distress. Parents, guardians, they themselves might be experiencing traumatic events or victims of traumatic events or experiencing increased trauma symptomatology that may be impacting their overall ability to support their children, support their young adults, and support individuals with disabilities. So the family unit in and of itself many times is impacted by economic distress and trauma symptoms, and therefore themselves may negatively impact outcomes related to rehabilitation and rehabilitation counseling outcomes. So with that, what can we do as rehabilitation counselors or rehabilitation professionals to address these issues? One, we need to be aware of the economic distress that individuals and communities are experiencing. When we work with individuals, it's important to understand that people's motivation, desire to work, overall attachment to work may be implicated by the economic distress that they are experiencing both as an individual, as a family, and as a community. So when we talk about people's connectedness to work, their desire to work, wanting to work, the importance of work, we need to understand that we need their economic environment, their economic distress is going to directly impact that. We need to try to understand how the individual is functioning in that area. Two, we need to be keenly aware of the impact of trauma, and we need to become aware of the trauma symptoms so that we can make referrals to appropriate mental health professionals to get a more in-depth trauma assessment. Again, as rehabilitation counselors in our role in Voc Rehab service provision, we are not there to diagnose or treat trauma, but we need to be keenly aware of the core trauma symptoms so that we can identify if individuals are currently impacted by or struggling with issues related to trauma that might be negatively impacting their employment outcomes. In my experience in dealing with state VR counselors across the country, many times counselors may inaccurately perceive somebody as being lacking motivation, not engaged, not able to follow through with activities, and maybe overlooking the impact that trauma and trauma symptoms might have on those individuals. The third component is the family involvement. As research has shown, getting the family involved is important and can increase outcomes. But with this, we also need to understand the first two issues, economic distress and trauma, as it relates to the family. We need to understand that these issues can impact the family, which in turn impact the individual that we're working with. So understanding from a broader contextual perspective the economic distress that individual family units might be under, particular people within the family unit might be under, and the trauma symptoms that might be going through the family, impacting the family, are going to be critically important if we want to understand our clients' motivations, our ability to work with individuals to maximize their employment outcomes, and to really maximize their desire to participate in work-related activities, we need to understand these three issues: economic distress, trauma, and the family unit. So moving forward, I would highly encourage you to look at those three units or those three issues and how they might be determining and impacting your work with the clients that you serve, the consumers that you work with. And I think as researchers and educators, we need to be more aware of how these three factors might be impacting vocational rehabilitation outcomes. Okay, all right.